Ampel is so much crashing that the only sort of remaining party in the system is the CDU, which now takes all the fruits basically for having done nothing in a way. Yeah, it seems as if Friedrich Merz is going to be the next chancellor. So what does this mean? Everybody knows that Friedrich Merz has relations to BlackRock, Atlantic Council, that he is a very tough Atlanticist. And if the CDU scores, say, a little bit more than 30%, the most likely thing is that he will do grand coalition again with the SPD. The US want to move out. Having said this, the US can move out of Ukraine because they got everything they wanted. I mean, they already cut the pipeline. They already has destroyed the German economy. There are some interesting articles out there that the overall US interest in that Ukrainian war was not so much whether Crimea belongs to Russia or Ukraine, but to destroy basically German or European economy. My fear is that Germany will be much less European than before, much more Atlanticist, and that it will single out of the European consensus. The US interest in ending the war in Ukraine is not to be nice with Europe. It's just that the US is out, got what it wanted to have, that if Germany goes too much Russia, continuation of the war, weaponization, I mean, everything we mentioned, that there will be so much distortions with the rest of Europe, because the rest of Europe, I think my instinct is the rest of Europe will not follow. So Germany could be in fraction with most of its European partners. And I think this will become, I think, the very strategic choice of this campaign.
Hello and welcome to our Strategic Compass program we do for Harici Portal. We do these talks on a variety of topics with experts from across the world. Today, I'm glad to announce that I'm joined by Professor Ulrike Guerro, who is a well-known professor of political science and international relations in Germany, and she is the director and the founder of the European Democracy Lab. Hello, Ulrike. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning.
Good morning. First of all, today is Wednesday as we basically record this program, and yesterday the news was saying that the German government not only crumbled, it had been crumbling over the last few days, but they fixed a date for the new elections. Now, let's start with that. And, it had been reported widely over the last 2 years or so that the government had become terribly unpopular. And presumably it was because of a number of problems, including its foreign policy, and the very expensive energy prices that was hurting German industries and all that. What is your take on that first? Let's start with it.
Well, again, thank you for having me here at Harici. It's the second time. I'm very pleased to talk about the situation in Germany and the crumbling Ampel coalition. What is now, I think, sure is that the new election will take place on the 23rd of February. So in basically 3 months' time, and 2 months' time. And the thing is that the coalition, as you say, was not well loved. I mean, the coalition was basically dead before. I mean, there was a lot of miscontent and resentment. And the real reason why it broke up formally was that Mr. Scholz forced the finance minister to basically cancel what we call the debt brake. We have a rule in the constitution that we cannot go over a certain level of debt making. And he wanted to break that rule of the constitution to buy more armaments and weapons for Ukraine. And the finance minister refused this. And this was the formal reason to basically break down the coalition. It came all at the day of the US election. So the US election, 6th of November, and a couple of hours later, it was streamed that the coalition will bring up. And that's the situation now. And the situation is highly confusing, because since the 6th of November, we have now, it's a week time, we have basically struggling for what will now happening with the election date. Will the chancellor delay the new elections? Because first he said that he would, he now needs to face the parliament. He will need to ask the, what we call the question of confidence. And then the confidence will be refused, and then the president can trigger new elections, right? But Olaf Scholz in the first momentum basically argued that he wants to delay the very act of asking the parliament the confidence. He wanted to delay this until the 20th of January. So he wanted to basically keep a balance of something like 2 months from now, December, January, yeah, to then pose the question of confidence, and then have another 60 days to wait for new elections. And that caused a lot of trouble, because it is basically the delayment of new elections, and now they found a compromise. And the compromise is 23rd of February.
Okay. Well, now the other point, obviously, because government had become almost like a lime duck, you know, it had been quite unpopular, and the German economy wasn't doing as good, as well as it used to, because that staggering confidence in the German economy and staggering growth rate seem to have been gone. Those days are over. And because of all that, the government had become quite unpopular. And there's also clearly a new situation in which the anti-establishment parties seem to be making quite considerable gains with the voters. Now, what is your view on that? You know, about the likelihood of the outcome?
Well, I mean, as you say, the government was basically in a disturbing mood since a couple of months. I mean, since roughly a year, since winter 23, there was talk about whether this Ampel coalition would last until the end, or whether we would go for new elections. So that talk is not new. And as you say, much of it is related to the prices of heating. As everybody knows, pipeline Nord Stream has been blown up. And so there is no more cheap gas coming from Russia, which has had a high impact on German industry prices, prices for energy, especially for industries. This is why many industries, I mean, there's really a deindustrialization in Germany, which is that big companies have been leaving Germany, are considering either to go to China or to go to the United States. There's also, because we had inflation and the overall economic situation was weakening, we had a depression for 2 or 3 months in a row. And then America or the United States, I mean, there were companies that were bought by the United States. So there was a huge sort of trouble in the economy, and obviously that impacts on population. I mean, if you have inflation, poor people are complaining about rising prices in energy, but prices of food, you know, food, there was 10-15% inflation last year. It's now getting down, but it was a moment. And all this basically is related obviously to the war in Ukraine, because we spend a lot of money for Ukraine, refugees coming, weapons, Taurus. I mean, all this talk about long missiles, but you know, the war preparation, which is building headquarters and so on and so forth. So there was a double impact of a shrinking economy, going into depression, high inflation for consumer prices, high energy prices, and war preparation. And all this created, you know, I mean, a very huge sentiment of uneasiness among citizens. And so, as you say, the non-conformist parties, or the parties standing a little bit outside of the political system, which is on the left hand, Sarah Wagenknecht, the former left sort of icon of the German left scenery, who created her own party, who launched her own party, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. And on the other hand, and who is a clear opponent of the war in Ukraine, And on the other hand, the AfD, which is the so-called popular party comparable to Marine Le Pen or to FPÖ or to Orban. And the AfD, because we had regional elections in September in 2 of our Länder countries like Thüringen and Saxonia, and the AfD basically had results around 30% and came out first party in Thüringen. And so we could see that the resentment of popular vote, we could observe in the regional elections that resentment would go to the fringe parties, because Sarah Wagenknecht also had astonishing results, double-digit astonishing results, and all this feeded the unhappiness, the uneasiness with the government coalition.
Well, good. Basically, last time I followed it, in the local elections, I think Zahra Wagenknecht's party was doing impressively well. It was doing extremely good in the local elections. I think her party is right over the 10% something or along those lines, and obviously the AfD is gaining 30%. So would you think that these 2 parties would form a coalition as a result of the election?
Well, no, I mean, this is exactly the problem. I mean, I agree with you that Sarah Wagenknecht did surprisingly well for a new party. The problem is that we have what we call Brandmauer, cordon sanitaire, like the French say, which is that the AfD is set to be not a partner for coalition. It's a little bit like what is happening in Austria, where the FPÖ came out first party, and then the von der Bellen, the Austrian president, basically decided to give the coalition making to Mr. Niethammer from the ÖVP, the sort of conservative party and not the right-wing party, because they are said to be sort of undemocratic parties, which is, for me, political scientist, a little bit of funny sort of explanation, because what shall that be, an undemocratic party? Yeah, but there is a very huge talk in Germany that we have democratic parties and undemocratic parties, and that the AfD is a so-called undemocratic party that you can't do a coalition with. And Sarah Wagenknecht and Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht is holding up what we call Brandmauer, cordon sanitaire, which is you don't do a coalition with the right-wingers. Yeah, I mean, it will be very interesting to follow this talk in the next weeks in Germany, when it will come to the new coalition making on the national level. But that is the reason why basically the AfD is kept out of the, say, political party system for now. And so there won't be a coalition, which, by the way, was the biggest problem in Thüringen. I told you that we had regional elections in Thüringen and in Saxonia. And in Thüringen, the AfD came out first party. And the problem was here again that normally the first party would go for being having the head of the parliamentary group and being the president of the Landtag, the president of the parliament. And there were, I would say, you know, some little gaming to prevent the AfD from getting the position of the president of the Landtag in Thüringen. And it was let's say it was a little bit of foul game. Yeah, I mean, it was in my opinion, it was not very clear what was happening there, but it was clear that the AfD was kept away, like it is. I mean, the AfD is also kept away in the Bundestag from positions that the party would own. For instance, every party has what we call an age president, Alterspräsident, and or every party has a vice president in the presidium of the German Bundestag, but the Bundestag doesn't allow that position to go to the AfD. So there are some of these, you know, say, juridical games to keep it out. And this has been playing off in Thüringen very, very neatly.
This foul game with those, I would call the anti-establishment or non-conformist party, is being gone across the board in Europe, isn't it? For instance, in France, in the parliamentary elections, there was this, what the Marine Le Pen side called dishonorable coalition that quickly was formed against them. But this sort of null games don't seem to be preventing these parties from gaining more votes. It seems as if they are going to gain more votes. Would you like to say something about that, and then we can move on to the impact of a new government in Germany in terms of the German foreign policy, but also Trump's rise to power, his comeback, and in what way is it likely to impact on German foreign policy as well as foreign policy of all the European countries?
Well, yes. I mean, it's very interesting that we saw in the United States with the elections that Trump, who had many lawsuits against him and was basically completely discredited by the whole system, by the Hollywood system, media system, by. I mean, he was totally excluded, but still had a huge victory at the end of the day. And it's a little bit the same in France and in Germany and also in Austria, to just name the three countries, because the AfD has been increasingly gaining, although there is a huge rhetoric in Germany due to our history, the past of our country, no more right-wing coalition. And so Germany is in a particular situation also because of our history. So there is a strong argument to make that we don't go right again or populist again. But still the AfD is... I'm not saying this, I mean, just to make that sure that I wouldn't compare the AfD to former Nazi parties, which is a strong argument in this country. And Germany is the only country in which basically we try to forbid the party. There is a strong momentum to go legally against the AfD and to basically forbid the party. And this is still an open thing. And this is not happening in France, nor in the United States, nor in Austria. Nobody is thinking about forbidding the Republican Party. So in that sense, in a way, the United States has been proven to be a resilient or resistant democracy, or whether one likes Trump or not. I mean, totally independent of that question. But the Republican Party has won, and nobody is sitting there and say it's an undemocratic party or the party should be forbidden. And that's the discussion that we have here in Germany. And I'm not sure how this will play off. Personally, I'm convinced that the AfD will not be forbidden, but there is a lot of legal game here. And as you say, still the AfD is growing. With respect to Sarah Wagenknecht, the national sort of scoring is something like 6%. She is lower in the western side than in the eastern side because she comes from the east, and the east has a communist socialist past, and socialism and communism is something that just doesn't sell well in Germany. So the western part has more problems with Sarah Wagenknecht. So So in an overall sort of German polling, Sarah doesn't score a double digit, but only 6%, which is still amazing for a new party. So these are the two conformist sort of ales, right and left. And with respect to the national polling, 23rd of February, well, we will need to see what happens. I could detail.
What about the external politics, basically? German policy, for instance, the last straw in the ongoing dispute in the coalition parties in the German government was the Prime Minister's request of the finance minister to go over the designated limit to borrow, to do more public borrowing to get money ready for Ukraine. So now, if, for instance, which seems quite likely, the American government were to decide to stop the war in Ukraine by cutting off aid to the Ukrainian government and by also jump-starting the negotiations with the Russian government one way or the other. I was at Valdai last week, and Putin came round to the Valdai audience once again. You know, he does it, I think, every year. Last year he did it. I was there, and he spoke to us for about 4.5 hours, and he didn't rule out this sort of engagement with the United States. And my hunches tell me, you know, there's also all these intellectual gathering, and then you get together and talk to each other. So you talk to the Russians, you talk to the Chinese. For instance, Chinese to be expecting a tough standoff between China and the United States, although they are not sure what sort of a shape this tense standoff will take. It'll gradually become, but you know, the Russian scholars, Russian experts appear to be more optimistic with Trump's comeback. So, you know, how these sort of things will impact, you think, on German foreign policy? I mean, would Germany and or together continue to support Ukraine on their own if the American government were to basically leave the Ukrainian government in its lurch?
Thank you for the question, Hassan. It's the most important question that we are dealing with. Yeah. To make a long story short, the most likely outcome is, very interestingly, that Friedrich Merz, CDU, Christian Conservative Party, will become chancellor. It seems like a given. Yeah, the CDU scores a little bit more than 30% now, 35. I mean, it's, you know, and in a way, the CDU is taking advantage from having been silent the last years. I mean, the thing is, the party was in opposition without being a real opposition, basically was, I wouldn't say doing nothing, but not much, you know. During Corona, they weren't responsible. Ukraine war, they weren't responsible. So it's basically fruits falling into their lap, yeah, because the party is not non-conformistic, because the non-conformistic parties are basically pushed away, the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht too. And then the Ampel is so much crashing that the only sort of remaining party in the system is the CDU, which now takes all the fruits basically for having done nothing in a way. Yeah. And then you also see that we are going out of 16 years of Angela Merkel. 16 years of Angela Merkel, 2005 to 2021. And the country was totally, I wouldn't, you know, tired of Angela Merkel. I mean, we had youth generations who never saw another chancellor than Angela Merkel. And then we had the refugee crisis and the Syrians coming. And there was, you know, the whole country was basically saying Angela Merkel needs to move out. And then finally she moved out. 16 years of CDU and only one Ampel coalition, so only 3 years and a half, destabilized the country so much that, interestingly enough, now everybody is wishing the CDU back. I mean, it's interesting in itself, yeah? And it also tells how quickly people can forget about what happened in the past, because in many respects, the Merkel coalition, the 16 years are responsible for what happened in the 3 years. I mean, even if the Ampel was, let's say, a lousy government, you cannot basically downgrade a country as quickly if you haven't been doing, I mean, Merkel structurally prepared many of the stuff that is now happening here now. For instance, the infrastructure, which is falling apart, you know, there were no investment during the Merkel years and so on and so forth. So all this to say that it's interesting that most of the citizens seem to have forgotten, and that now it seems as if Friedrich Merz is going to be the next chancellor. So what does this mean? Everybody knows that Friedrich Merz has relations to BlackRock, Atlantic Council, that he is a very tough Atlanticist. And if the CDU scores, say, a little bit more than 30%, the most likely thing is that he will do grand coalition again with the SPD. And in the SPD, the guy who has the most sympathy scoring now is Boris Pistorius, who is the finance minister, the defense minister. And Boris Pistorius also is a guy who since 2 years now, or more than a year now, is heavily arguing for war, heavily preparing the country for being kriegstüchtig, getting the country ready for war. He is the guy who decided that in Rostock we are building a sort of NATO headquarter. We don't call it headquarter because it would be illegal to call it that way, but it's basically a headquarter. Then to make the Wiesbaden another military sort of crossroad for military crossing. So what you can see is that there might be an alliance between Friedrich Merz and Pistorius as a defense minister, with two guys in a way heavily heading for now Europe must defend itself. We now need to fulfill NATO 2% goal. The US are withdrawing from Ukraine. We must do it on our own, and so on and so forth. So, and the interesting question is now twofold, because obviously Trump is decided to move out of Ukraine. That apparently he has told to Orban already. Orban is the existing in place, the EU president of the European Council. So there have been talks. So it seems to be that the US want to move out. Having said this, the US can move out of Ukraine because they got everything they wanted. I mean, they already cut the pipeline. They already has destroyed the German economy. There are some interesting articles out there that the overall US interest in that Ukrainian war was not so much whether Crimea belongs to Russia or Ukraine, but to destroy basically German or European economy. And that is largely taking place. I already talked about deindustrialization, energy prices, the pipeline, and so on. So that, if you say that this has been could have been in the US interest, this goal is already reached. And so also with respect to the land in Ukraine, I mean, land grabbing, because the surfaces, agricultural surfaces, have already been bought. So now Ukraine, the US has what it wanted, yeah? And the price for rebuilding Ukraine, I mean, what will be happening to rebuild Ukraine? What will be happening there also in other will Ukraine become, say, a territory for rebuilding new structures of governance, for exploring how you can rebuild a country under new conditions of transformation, and so on and so forth. I think that will happen. And the real question is, why should Germany decide to do it? For me, the overall question is that Europe, in large, has now the chance to go for peace. I think that Europe should go for peace. I think that Europe, especially Germany, France, Italy, should basically listen to Orban, should go to see Putin and say, look, we need to go back to what once upon a time we wanted as a European security architecture. Because it seems clear that Europe, especially Germany, has no chance to survive if we are cut through. Now that the Finns and the Swedes have also been joining NATO, and that there is sort of a little West Europe that is cut from the eastern part of the continent. This cannot be a future. But it seems to be that essentially Friedrich Merz, instead of making that European argument strong, and instead of saying that Europe needs another solution other than basically complying what the US wanted to do with Ukraine on our own. I mean, why should Europe have geostrategic choices with respect to the eastern part that are not in its own interest just because it wasn't in a way an American interest? You know, I don't see it. And I think this will be a very important question in the German election campaign, because there are some voices who say, like Sarah Wagenknecht, for instance, but also the AfD, I mean, also other voices who say, look, we have no interest in basically following a US-led policy towards Russia and being harsh on Russia instead of following our own interests. Somebody, as you know, a commentator, I read an article, said it's like hanging stones on the neck of Europe. Yeah, Ukraine is hanging the stones of Ukraine on the neck of Europe. And because Germany has such a strategic, important role to play in the European governance, it will be crucial to wait for the German decision, whether in a way Friedrich Merz will tilt the balance towards, say, an Atlanticist strategy or European strategy?
Well, now we are into very interesting parts of our discussion, actually, because if a CDU government were to come in coalition with another party or on its own, and then if that party were to persist in its war efforts against Russia in Ukraine without the United States, maybe together with France, wouldn't it also create enormous problems financially, economically, but also strategically with the United States? Because wouldn't it also complicate things within NATO? Because I mean, what you are describing is in the absence of the United States in Ukraine, Germany, and France basically taking over the United States' role against Russia, then that would be a completely different kettle of fish, wouldn't it? I mean, it would complicate Europe's relations with the United States within NATO. And for us, for instance, in Turkey, it would be a completely different political and geopolitical situation in Turkey's relations with Germany, France. Wouldn't it be bad from my perspective, you know, my personal perspective, to see Germany, France acting independently of the United States so that Turkey would actually establish good relations with these countries on an individual basis, all that. But, you know, you would be talking about a completely different situation.
Yeah, but you know, the real question is whether Germany is already singling out of a European consensus. I mean, even in France, if you listen to French TV these days, the French are basically mentioning Napoleon. You know, we had that experience to go military against the Russians and so on and so forth. So the French are much more willing to have what I call an emancipatory approach now, and to say, look, our interest is to have an emancipated sovereign Europe, and we distinguish from the US interest. We want to be Europe here, and we want to have a peace order, and we do not basically pursue that war. And so the real question is whether we can find a Franco-German agreement on this. It seems to me as if the French today have quite a different look on that Ukraine war than Friedrich Merz if he became chancellor, right? So that's the first thing. The problem is in Europe that we do not have a functioning Franco-German tandem as we had it in the past. When France and Germany agreed, then Europe was in a good place, yeah? But this Ukrainian war is basically an alliance from Washington, London, Warsaw, the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, and then the Baltic countries to Kiev. That was the axis which basically drove the war and weaponization policy. It wasn't Italy and France and Germany and the, say, classical tandem partners in the European West. If you look now on Turkey, for instance, yeah, Turkey had very strong anti-NATO demonstrations recently. So there is no consensus. In my opinion, there is in the European Union, there is no consensus to continue this warfare. The southern countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and even France, as I said, are, I think, in favor of ending. And Germany is the pivotal country, yeah. And that is why it's so important to watch out what Friedrich Merz will do, whether he will opt out for a transatlantic sort of spin in his foreign policy and continue a US-driven sort of ambition to go to war against Russia, or to, you know, den Krieg nach Russland tragen. I mean, there are some harsh mentions in, you know, Roderich Kiesewetter, who is one of the folks, say, in the CDU. So whether that will continue or whether the CDU will fall back into basically what Helmut Kohl did. Helmut Kohl was always there saying we need a European approach, we need a European policy, and the policies that Helmut Kohl would have been shaping in the 90s were the two things. We need a political union, Maastricht, you know, and then we need a security architecture with Russia, and that was the Charter of Paris in 1991. So for me, there is a very interesting tipping point here, to which extent Friedrich Merz will look at this question being pivotal for, because Germany is pivotal in Europe. And my fear is that Germany will be much less European than before, much more Atlanticist, and that it will single out of the European consensus. Also, if you look, Thierry Breton, the former French commissioner, recently said in French TV, now we can talk peace in Brussels. It was a very interesting look on Twitter, or X. Thierry Breton had very interesting remarks that you couldn't talk about peace in official Brussels meetings. And then he came to French TV and said a couple of days after Trump was elected, now we can talk peace in Brussels. And it's interesting that a former very important commissioner is saying this. So here is my take. My take is that many people in Europe are desperately seeking coming closer to Russia for peace solutions, for negotiations, for having peace with Ukraine. And most in Europe do not want to take the burden of, this, like I said, hanging the stones of Ukraine around the European neck, that this sort of rebuilding or financing should not be a European thing because we didn't cause that war. Yeah. And the very question of Friedrich Merz will be that one. And it's very interesting to see, because let me say this, beyond the war, Trump will not be nice with Europe. I think everybody has understood now that with the minister, the United States will denominate with the tax, all this taxation thing, with the economic warfare that we will see. The US interest in ending the war in Ukraine is not to be nice with Europe. It's just that the US is out, got what it wanted to have, and now is basically continuing to do economic warfare, statecrafting, everything, taxation, buying the companies with Europe. So it will not be nice. And that is one argument more for Europe to unite around a strategy. And the strategy should, I think, personally, be a different strategy than just complying with what the US wants Europe to do in Ukraine. And again, most European countries, I think, do not want this. So Friedrich Merz has a very, very important decision to take. And the question is really what he thinks Europe should be in the next decade.
Well, excellent. Just one short topic, basically. The topic is extensive, of course, but we can limit our debate on the topic. We can keep it quite concise. That is the unwanted refugees. I think the unwanted refugees is one of the points on which all the non-conformist, as you put it, all anti-establishment parties agree on. And it seems that their attitude and their approach to the unwanted refugees has also been taken up by mainstream parties, like in Germany, for instance. The current government in power basically decided to lift the Schengen regulations for a while, and then it had to do it because otherwise, it was its standing with the public, particularly as they realized in local elections, was getting even more problematic. So on this question, whoever comes to power in Germany, what would you say basically on the question of unwanted refugees? Because this is also going to be a very topical issue in the United States too. How Trump is going to basically make good on his promises to check out all the unwanted refugees, one or the other. He's quite certain, as to what he wants to do. he's going to build a wall. He's going to be extremely serious about all his promises on the topic. In the case of Germany, what are your conclusions, basically, from what the politicians have been talking about?
Look, I mean, as you say, it's a very, very sensitive question, which is highly emotional, with the huge, amount of refugees coming into the country in 2016. By the way, I mean, Turkey has playing a very important role in this, as you know. I mean, because there was this Turkish-German agreement, and Turkey also had a big load of refugees, you know. I mean, just to say this, I mean, I think Turkey, to just say this, has been playing a very say, polite and pleasant role in the whole deal making, and I just wanted to give you this accomplishment that Turkey really was important, yeah. And still, the problem is the refugee question. And you know, the thing is that government parties, even the SPD, has been turning around in recent days and weeks. And this asylum seekers which are brought back to the countries, and flights which are organized to basically bring people back home, has been government positions also. So it's hard. I mean, the thing is that the non-conformist parties talk about this pretty loudly, but the government parties are doing the same without talking about it. Yeah. So in a way, they do the dirty business without talking about it. So I wouldn't be too, blaming the non-conformist party, but it's true that the emotional sort of leverage of the refugee question, be it mosques built in German towns, be it killings or violations. Yeah, there's a huge question about violations and gender questions in this refugee migration question, which are very easily inflammable. Yeah, I mean, and I think what we will see is that all parties will have a tougher stance on refugees. It's the conformist parties have been building up the pressure so that the, say, non-conformistic classical parties of the system will need to react. It is one of the overarching big important themes. Having said this, it is also inflation and the economic situation, and it's also the war. And then there's a little bit of climate, yeah. But so these are the big concerns of German citizens. I could imagine that the campaign will be more around the really strategic choice that Chancellor Merz, if he becomes Chancellor, will need to make between what I mentioned, a more Atlanticist orientation of the country, or an emancipatory European sort of thing, seeing the cleavages within Europe. Because I could imagine personally that if Germany goes too much Russia, continuation of the war, weaponization, I mean, everything we mentioned, that there will be so much distortions with the rest of Europe. Because the rest of Europe, I think my instinct is the rest of Europe will not follow. It's not only Orban or the Slovaks, Fico, but it's also the Greeks and, you know, the southern line. So Germany could be in fraction with most of its European partners. And I think this will become, I think, the very strategic choice of this campaign, because it's not only geostrategy, it's also geoeconomics. It's sort of, you know, what I with Trump and the taxation and the state crafting sort of, because the United States are shifting from economic policy to state crafting policy. Everything in the economy will be submitted to national interest. Yeah. And so geopolitics becomes geoeconomics. And then we are in the midst of everything that touches the citizens in Germany, which is heating and costs in inflation and so on and so forth. And I think this will be the most dominant topic in the elections, and the migration question will fall a little bit back in the attention span. It's my take, because in a way, the question is, I wouldn't say settled. Of course, it's not settled, but the governmental parties already have started to take this very serious.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our time, and thank you really for this very illuminating interview with us for Hariji. And hope to see you personally sometime in not too distant future. Otherwise, we conclude our program with your remarks, and then thank you very much.
Thank you, Hans.
Well, we've come to the end of our program today. We were joined by Professor Ulrike Gero of Germany, the founder and director of European Democracy Lab. And we had an extensive talk about the upcoming German elections and the pressing issues with the German public in particular, the war in Ukraine, and what is likely to come out as a result of the elections. Well, we'll be together again, and I'll come on again with another guest, an expert, a different topic. But for today, that's all from us. Thank you very much for listening and watching to us.
Bye-bye.